Now, the fact that it takes place in the White House itself goes a long way towards making it special and memorable, and this is something of what President Washington had in mind all those years ago. We talked about the fact the other day that he was the president who insisted that the White House be built. He wanted a grand home for the president, for the chief executive, and he knew that it would be used not just for official acts, but also for entertaining. So, of course, the house he wanted would have been a lot bigger than the house we got. He wanted a house that would have been 5 times larger than the house that was built. But it was still the largest house in America until well after the Civil War. And it has many, many rooms for entertaining, different kinds of parlors. So we talked about the fact that the house itself was built by Washington. What we haven't looked at yet is the idea that how does the entertaining happen? How does protocol work between a head of state who is not a king or an emperor and his counterparts overseas? I mean, we tend to think, it's human nature to think that however things are being done right now is how things have always been done. But that's not the case. Our founding fathers and mothers had to invent American protocol and diplomacy as they went along. One big question was, what would the president be called? There were plenty of people who simply thought he should replace George III as a monarch. They wanted to call him His Majesty, His Highness. They called Mrs. Washington Lady Washington. They would have been very happy to establish Washington in a hereditary monarchy. Fortunately for all of us, he was not interested in that idea, absolutely refused it. No, he was an elected president. But there were people who were trying to figure out how this would work. So at one point, the president was to appear at a reception, the room filled with the guests. His aide threw open the door and announced, "His High and Mightiness, the President of the United States." Well, the president went in, he greeted the guests, he did what he needed to do. But when he came out of that reception, he grabbed that aide by the lapels and said, "You have taken me by surprise this once, sir, but by God it shall not happen again." He was determined not to be referred to as His High and Mightiness. So eventually they settled on Mr. President. The First Lady title didn't come until long after, but Mr. President worked for George Washington. So that was one of the things that he did. The other thing he did was that his form of entertaining was driven by architecture. Are there any architects in the room? Anybody do architecture, design work? Well, I know this is kind of a faint image, but if you look at the center top of this, you will see an oval shape. It's what they called a diagram of an elliptical room. Washington loved oval rooms, and he loved them because he believed that if a room did not have corners for people to hang back in and be shy, everyone would have to step out and be part of whatever was going on. He thought that facilitated entertaining. So his entertaining was called a levee, and the form it took was that all of you as guests would arrive early, and you would station yourselves around the perimeter of that oval. And then when everyone was in place, the president would arrive, and he would step into the room and step up to the first person and bow, and you would exchange remarks, and then he'd step to the next person and bow and make remarks until he went all the way around the room. So it was like a reverse order receiving line. And after he had greeted everyone, he would go and stand in front of the fireplace with his hat in his hand, and the guests would come and bow, and he would bow back, and the guests would leave. Sounds exciting, right? But while he was standing there holding what appeared to be his hat, but it was not actually a hat he could have put on his head. It was a specially made hat that had a wooden brace inside it to make it easy for him to hold. And the reason he wanted to do that, he did not want to shake your hand. He was not personally snobbish, but Washington just believed that shaking hands was too familiar for the President of the United States. So since he had his hat in his hand, it was perfectly and the other hand on the hilt of his sword, it was perfectly appropriate for him to bow and for you to bow back. So that saved him from having to ignore your outstretched hand. And everyone knew not to do that. But he loved oval rooms, and he insisted that they be incorporated into the design of the White House. And the next time I speak, we're going to look at all of them in a little more detail. But the most famous one is the Blue Room on the State Floor, a beautiful oval receiving room.